Hey everybody, Jason Bermas here, and in this segment, I've really got a treat for you. We've got one of what I would consider the pioneers of actual independent media, somebody I've known now for the better part of 2 decades. I can't believe it's been almost 20 years, but it really has. And, you know, this road wasn't paved with traditional conservatism. This road was paved really with what I would say, at least in the beginning of what was to me the true truth movement, was a lot of the left. And we were really shunned by the right, made fun of by the right. And it's been kind of bizarre to see that world inverted, but somebody who's really never swayed and continued to challenge the narrative on both sides is Dan Dix and Press for Truth. You can go to pressfortruth.ca. What is that galvanizing moment, Dan, that brought you into the fray of alternative media? Because I remember all the way back in the day, probably before Press for Truth, when you were starting to go to events and ask tough questions of officials that no one in the mainstream media would ask. And we're talking probably 2007, maybe even 2006. And you were just on fire. And what I've always loved about your approach is you're not hysterical, you're not loud, you're very concise, and you're to the point, and you're asking a tough question. Tell us about that.
Sure. You know, the tipping point, you're correct. It was actually 2006. And at that point, I had already been doing this type of stuff for quite some time, but I hadn't really come up with my own kind of identity. You know, I was joining a lot of different groups that I had met up with. But then everything changed when the Bilderberg group was coming to Ottawa, Canada. That's just a few hours drive for me. So I was like, I'm going to go cover this. And that's when the first time I ever actually brought a camera with me. And I was like, I'm not going to this anymore as like a protester or an activist or anything like that. I want to just I want to document this. I want to be a videographer. I want to film these guys and question them on video. That was the first time I got a taste of doing any of that kind of stuff. And that was the moment I knew I wanted to do that for the rest of my life, essentially. So yeah, 2006, I came up with the name Press for Truth and just been banging out videos ever since.
So let's talk about some of those early engagements. Who were the officials that you were confronting, and what awoke you initially to the Bilderberg group, which I would say is still largely an influence at the top of the power structure in this post-truth world that I would also argue they helped to create?
Well, I must say, Jason, it's one of the films that you were involved with in the early years that had a big part to do with me wanting to take my activism and my research to the next level. And that, of course, was Loose Change. I mean, that really opened up my mind in ways that I have never even could have imagined were possible. And that was one of the really key events that, you know, wanted me to start getting more active and out in the streets. So essentially, it was one of the films that you were initially working on that is responsible for, you know, me wanting to get out into the streets and launching Press for Truth. So that was probably one of the major ones, you know. And then I started seeing prime ministers and heads of media, heads of finance, heads of military operations, and started confronting them to the face. I've so far confronted, what is it, like 4 Canadian prime ministers, I think? Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, Trudeau, and there's probably another one that I'm forgetting right now. But
isn't that incredible that you've literally approached the supposed apex of the power structure? Although I would argue, and I'm sure that you would argue, these guys are really the puppets, the front men that are just pushing the agenda in many cases. But you've been up close and personal so many times with these people that you might forget one or two. And let me argue again that the work that you've done is so much more important than the mainstream media, because as I highlight, and you highlight in my film Shade the Motion Picture, when we're actually at Bilderberg 2012 in Chantilly, Virginia, a lot of the people who are within the media power structure are actually inside with these leaders. I mean, speak to that aspect of it.
Well, I can tell you an interesting story about that. One time, I had managed to infiltrate Bilderberg Hotel while it was on lockdown. And so the only people in there were Bilderberg members, and there was a small clique of the press who were staying at the Bilderberg Hotel. And I ran into them in this little smoking lounge. And I found out that these were like the top guys at CNN, MSNBC. There was a lot of them there. And I found out that they were staying at the Bilderberg Hotel, but were being flown out every day to Munich to cover the G7 in Munich. And I said to them, are you not covering what's happening right here in this very hotel that you're staying in this weekend? And they were like, what's happening in this hotel? They didn't even know. They had no clue that the Bilderberg conference was going on in this very same hotel that I was in. And you know, once I explained to them who's here, what they're doing, they have more power and influence than people at G7. They were like, wow. They said this to me off the record, but they're like, wow, you are doing the real journalism. What you are doing is true journalism, and we essentially just accept a paycheck. And he absolutely wasn't kidding, because I went and visited the G7 in Munich while I was there. I managed to get in there as well. I got a G7 press pass. And when I went in there, Jason, I was given free food, free champagne, clothes, a backpack. They offered B-roll footage, so I didn't even have to do any work. And I mean, what journalist in there is going to speak negatively about such an organization if they're being pampered and treated like that? It was just mind-boggling to see firsthand. But yeah, just a little interesting story of when I ran into the MSM at Bilderberg, and they didn't even know what was going on.
And you know, that's so important. Because, you know, I guess that Klaus Schwab, he's come onto the scene now, but he's kind of been at the World Economic Forum level. And just like there's a United Nations level, there's also a G7 and a G8 and a G20 level. But those are largely mouthpieces for the people that make the real decisions within that Bilderberg power structure that then extends out to other roundtable groups such as the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, the banking cartels. Now BRICS is going to have an influence. Well, I don't think most people that are on the outside looking in, now starting to get into this information, not really understanding it's bigger than left or right or the suppression of conservatives, understand is that this is complex. There are competing factions, but at the end of the day, Dan, as you know, this is really about collectivism mixed with authoritarianism into techno-fascism and ultimately transhumanism. So I know that's a mouthful, but can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, yeah, it's been a part of the agenda to march us towards ultimately more control is always been the agenda. And you know, speaking of transhumanism, I mean, what better of a way to control man is to slowly morph him into basically a machine. What do you do with machines? You absolutely completely control them. So it's really kind of a scary world we're delving into here. I just recently put out a video, maybe a month ago now, that scientists have just discovered how to create a human embryo without eggs or without sperm or without the process of fertilization. It's just absolutely wild. And beyond that, now they're getting to the point of being able to literally read thoughts. They've just developed this new thing. It can't like exactly word for word pick out what you are picturing in your mind, but it can essentially paint a picture. They did experiments where people would watch a movie, and the program was able to come up with a plot based on their brain waves. So this is very, very real. This is something I know you've been talking about for decades, and it's all starting to play out in front of our very eyes. I know you cover how Elon Musk seems to be the kind of posing as the champion of this thing, but you and I both know he's not the savior at the end of the day. In fact, maybe quite the opposite. So really, really interesting times that we're finding ourselves in here, Jason.
You know, we might get to the Muskernuts later. You know, it's Klaus Schwab, it's the Muskernuts. These are the faces we're given. It's almost like you're given this Bond-esque Tony Stark figure that's offering you the same exact thing as the Dr. Evil Bond-like villain, And you want to believe, you know, they're at opposition because you got a guy like Klaus painting the great narrative, right? That's his new book. That's the next thing after the Great Reset and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. But then you've got the Musker nuts coming up with $44 billion to free Twitter, and I've yet to see anything free. I see the same fact checks that were there 2 months ago. I just saw more fact checks. As they do this, and I know that you're a Christian, and, you know, I'm pretty agnostic at best, but I acknowledge there's absolutely a spiritual aspect to this, and one of the things they've wanted to do is destroy traditional religions that are also associated with the traditional family structures. And one of the new ways, it's not new, but one of the more bold ways I believe they've been doing this in this movement of command and control through their sustainability and green movement is recently they had their COP27. And they actually launched their new global religion. It's a Gaia religion, and did a prayer at Mount Sinai on behalf of this.
Really?
Oh, they did, Dan. Oh, they did.
Not surprising. I mean, it is a new religion. This whole, I mean, look at these kids going around here destroying old works of art, completely brainwashed into thinking that this is something that's going to, you know, benefit society. It's absolutely shocking that it's gotten to this point, Jay. I'm sure you've seen some of this. Another one just happened, I think, like yesterday or something. They threw maple syrup on a painting who the artist was actually in support of the causes that they are against. So it's absolutely mind-boggling. But yeah, no, that's one of the major things that's being used moving forward for control. And you mentioned like how the WEF has control of these certain people, and when we want to talk about the destruction of the family unit and things that are going to lead towards the downfall of Christian society here in Canada, you got to look to the top. And the top right now is Justin Trudeau, and he's just absolutely out of control, unbelievable. I'm sure you've been covering or watching what's happened over the last year with the Trucker Freedom Convoy. But beyond that, you know, he is like, for example, next week he's going to be on a TV show as a special guest on Canada's Drag Race. You know, this is the guy who takes his children to the Pride Parade. If you want to talk about destroying the family unit, just look what Justin Trudeau is doing as a transgender activist here in Canada. It's shocking, really.
Well, you know, let's be honest about Justin Trudeau for a moment. The guy is on film several times, not just in blackface, not just as Aladdin, folks, in a camp video where I actually got censored on YouTube for daring to put it in a thumbnail, where I not only highlighted the guy was in full blackface, but that he had put an artificial, I would say 18-inch to 24-inch dong snake down his pants to his knees. I mean, I want everybody just to let that one sink in, that got a total pass from the mainstream media, that he was doing that in college with his rich buddies, and it was hilarious to them. You know, that's not, I just want to let everybody know, that's not quote unquote white privilege. Okay. That's billionaire privilege. That's what that is. That's establishment privilege. That's how you get away with Johnny nonsense like that.
Yeah, well, the guy, you know, was born and raised with the silver spoon in his mouth. We've always kind of known he's been primed and prepped and shaped and molded for this very position that he's currently in, and he's doing their bidding wonderfully. Right now, they are, you know, there's a public inquiry into his invocation of the Emergencies Act. This is something that's never ever been done in Canada. That the Emergencies Act has been invoked. This is something that's meant for wartime, but he came up with excuses to do so in order to clamp down on a very legitimate, peaceful protest that I went there to cover in Ottawa in February of 2022, I'm sure the whole world was watching as the Canadian truckers went to the Canadian capital of Ottawa. And by the time I got there, they were just starting to shut it down. I managed to film the massive clampdown. I took a brutal baton to the ribs. This is like 9 months ago, I believe, and I'm still dealing with this. Like when I sleep, and sometimes it hurts, and when I drive, it hurts a little bit. So unbelievable what happened there. But there is a public inquiry happening right now, and I will say, the man who's been in charge of all of this, the Bill Blair, was also the guy who was in charge during the G20 summit in Toronto 12 years ago in 2010. Now, there was a public inquiry into that too, and it took 10 years, but 10 years later, there was a $16.5 million class action lawsuit that was awarded to all the people who were arrested at the G20. Everybody received anywhere between like $5,000 and $30,000 a pop for everybody who got arrested. So justice can be served, but it's not necessarily going to happen anytime soon here in Canada. It might take a little bit of time, but people are trying to get to the bottom of what happened there in Ottawa, because it was an absolutely massive violation of our rights as Canadians to be able to protest. And, you know, the whole world, I think, saw it for what it is, which is why we're now seeing this public inquiry.
Yeah, and that's not to mention the debanking. And the debanking is you had the deplatforming, the misinformation.
They froze bank accounts, literally froze bank accounts of people I know. There's this one guy, he runs a newspaper called Druthers. I think he raised $100,000 to give to the truckers. And he was going to walk into the bank that day, get a bunch of money order checks that is basically as good as money, $10,000 each, you know, 100 of them or whatever, and pass them all out to the truckers. And when he went to do that, he found out his personal bank account was frozen. And he's not the only one. There were a couple hundred people who had their accounts frozen. If that can happen to you, that's not a free country, you know, where they can just automatically cut you off because they don't like your opinion on a certain matter. Unbelievable.
Well, again, that's the global model, you know, and all this fear of China, we should fear the model of government, not China itself, that they've brought in. And then that is the quote unquote Rockefeller model, the Kissinger model, the global model that's been driven through the mouthpieces of the World Economic Forum, through the authoritative sources of the United Nations. So now you see that they have changed the language on gender. And there is now a multitude of genders. And now they are very much a part of an agenda that I know you've covered. And it is a transgender one. You mentioned the Drag Race show and Trudeau. But at the end of the day, and we'll go over this in a moment, but I want to specifically talk about one of the cases that you dealt with. Transgenderism is about transhumanism and disconnecting you from your biological body and really reality. And the idea that you're also a 0 or a 1, non-binary, you can go back and forth. It promotes this agenda that you're a cog in the machine. It promotes this simulation agenda or multiverse agenda where you don't really have free will and you're not a human being, essentially. And look, as I know, you're very libertarian on most issues. If you're an adult and you want to do these things, do your thing. But once you involve children or the abuse of other people, that's where you draw the line. But this is a very real agenda, and you fought one of those agendas in the case where a biological man demanded that he have his nuts waxed. Okay, at these salons where obviously the women who had been performing this for years, sometimes decades, I'm sure, didn't want to do it. Shocker. And there was a whole court case about it. Tell us, first of all, refresh our memories about that case. And then you were really at the forefront of that, and you took some heat, but you're, again, in the right, Dan.
Well, yeah. I mean, this is a guy who goes by the name of Jessica Yaniv, who was going around filming and recording the phone calls because, I mean, he was looking for a lawsuit, really. based on discrimination, calling around the different female waxing places to see if he can get a wax job. But then once he sets up the appointment, he drops the bomb that, oh, by the way, I'm trans. And then when he shows up, they realize, oh, we're not equipped for this. We've never done it. We don't know how to handle this, and we don't even want to. This is not something I want to do. Like, some of them might be a married woman, you know, with a husband at home who's just like, I can't be doing this. It's just ridiculous. And he took them to court. And I went to the court proceedings, and it was funny. The first thing he said when he opened his mouth was that he needs to leave, and the judge was just like, he's free to be here. But anyways, he ended up losing, and having to pay for that. I think he ended up having to pay some fines or something, but don't quote me on that. But he did lose that court battle. But I kind of stopped paying attention to him a little while ago, because that's really all he's looking for. But now I'm sure you've heard about this teacher in Oakville who just a few days ago, the school board in Oakville, Ontario, ruled that this man, who's a biological male teaching woodshop, who wears these massive, massive, huge fake breasts, is allowed to dress however he wants, because in order to put a dress code on the staff, that may lead to litigation, and it could be considered discriminatory. Screw the kids. Forget about the rights of the children. They're sticking up for the rights of this pervert teacher who's carrying out a sexual fetish in class in front of young boys, because they're overly politically correct. The pendulum has swung so far to the other side that we really need to bring things back into the center for some balance here, because you know, it's gotten to this point. It's just crazy. You know what? Another thing just popped in my head, Jason. I'm a big fan. I'm a nerd for the sport of disc golf. I love disc golf. I play disc golf all the time. I watch disc golf tournaments. And today I was watching a tournament earlier, and for whatever reason, I decided to look in the description, and I noticed in the description it had a disclaimer about transgender athletes. I was like, what? Why is that? So I started looking, and I noticed the female tour that's happening today, one of the players is transgender, and I just had to point out that this is so unfair to the women who have worked so hard to get to that position that they are in, that this guy can just kind of come along and start competing. And, you know, I made the comment and got some flack for it that, you know, I might as well identify as being handicapped so that I can just crush the dreams of all the kids at the Special Olympics. That should be okay, right? And if anybody disagrees with that, you're just bigoted, right? And you're being discriminatory. I mean, this is the slippery slope.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because, you know, let's talk about that slope. Let's talk about discrimination, and we'll even bring up people that are physically and mentally handicapped and the chromosome issue. So are you aware of a person named Martine Rothblatt?
No, I don't think so.
Well, you should be. So Martine Rothblatt is the most powerful transgender person on the planet.
Is that the one who kind of took down Tavistock?
No, oh no.
Okay.
Oh, no. Martine Rothblatt. Oh boy. To start it with Dan Dix, if he doesn't know about Martine. Martine Rothblatt actually founded Sirius Radio, was very involved in satellites and basically how they were structured, made a lot of money there, and then started United Therapeutics, which is into the xenotransplantation phase and taking organs that will eventually be used in humans. The FDA is now approving that. All right. Also the most, again, powerful transgender author on the planet, and a open transhumanist that has their own religion called Terrasim, and has written books like this, Dan, back in 2011. From transgender to transhuman, where in the very first page after the intro, Martine advocates for billions of sexes, and basically says that marking a person at birth because of their accidental biology, okay, as male or female, will be considered just as unfair as South Africa's now abolished practice of stamping black or white on people's ID cards. So equating it with apartheid. And then if you scroll down, you'll see when a doctor sees a small penis, they're told it's a boy, a small vagina, it's a girl. So not billions of people, but billions of sexes. This person is also the author of such hits as unzipped jeans. This is in '97, by the way. Where taking charge of baby making in the new millennium, where the advocation is there is no biological, you decide when you have kids, everything is genetically moved. And then Virtually Human, the promise and peril of digital immortality, with a foreword by Ray Kurzweil, of course, who also has a woman persona, doppelganger named Ramona. So these people, I'm not done. In Terrasim, which was the symbol in the middle there, actually, Martine has rebuilt the wife that Martine married as Martin, replicated it as Bina 48 in this religion. And do I have one more here? Oh, yeah, we'll get into that in a moment. That's a little bit different. But this person is very much an advocate of this. I've been playing clips where there was a Transformers conference. You can't make this up. They called it Transformers, Dan. That was put on in 2016 by the good people at the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, of course, and then sponsored by the very good people at Lockheed Martin and Samsung. And it opened with Martine. If you want, we could play some clips, but I want to get your initial reaction here. All right?
All right.
Open with Martine. It moved to NASA and DARPA. And then one of the last segments, they had the CEOs and founders of Reddit and Twitch talking about content moderation and basically, cutting people off and deplatforming them. And this is all in 2016. It's a pretty wild watch. It's in 2 parts. You can watch the whole thing on C-SPAN. But there's also a segment with this guy named Neil Harbison, who I don't know if you've ever seen him, but he has like the little fish dongle that's out of his head brain chip. Have you ever seen it?
Not sure.
Oh, boy, it's fun. And he admits that although it's not big now through the 2020s, just like transgender surgeries were kind of a bit underground in the 50s and 60s and then accepted, that you'll start seeing them more and more underground and they'll be accepted by like 2030s. I guess we'll play some of that for you. But what's your initial reaction now seeing there's literally a manifest? By the way, the transgender to transhuman, the subtitle of it is A Manifesto of the Freedom of Form.
Wow. I mean, I'm obviously not surprised. There had to have been some sort of serious mechanism working behind the scenes to get us to this point, because it really didn't take that long. So I'm really not surprised. I not too long ago saw that film, What is a Woman? And I thought that was a really well done, actually. And in there, it gets into a little bit of the history of some of these people who are behind the idea of transgenderism. And it goes back, pretty far. And then I think of that one interview with Yuri Bezmenov that G. Edward Griffith did with them, where he explains how all that is necessary is for just a couple of generations worth of people to be conditioned into this mind thinking that it'll be almost impossible to undo, and it'll just like expand exponentially, and it will in fact take the same amount of generations to undo this, this slow march. So just wild, man. So yeah, I'm curious to see some of these clips, because this is the first I've heard of that.
So let's start then with Neil Harbison, and essentially this dongle allows him to connect through Wi-Fi to networks that are transmitting information. He claims later on, basically they can send him like colors that he feels, and you can add senses. That's his claim. All right, and he's kind of a quirky looking guy, but let's let him describe it for himself.
But that humans don't have. So we are in a stage in history that we can actually design what species we want to be. I consider myself a trans species because I'm adding senses and organs that other species have. And you can add many, many more senses that other species have and organs that other species have. And we'll start seeing this in the 20s because it's now growing. It's happening underground. There's already many surgeons that are willing to do the surgery anonymously, in the same way that in the 50s and 60s, transgender operations were being done a bit underground. Now cyborg surgeries are being done a bit underground. But in the end, bioethical committees will also accept the cyborg surgeries should be allowed for everyone that wants to extend their perception of reality, at least to the level of...
So that's Harbison. Okay, and that's just, again, what kind of one of the tools of this movement for transhumanism. But he admits, you know, we're kind of moving the needle via this transgender movement, just kind of in the same way. And then we're going to play this clip of Rothblatt. Now, transgenderism, I mean, this person pulled the trigger. I'll say that. You know what I mean? Been transgender for some time. But transhumanism is really two different things. You have the idea, and by the way, Rothblatt is involved in both. The idea where you're going to clone your consciousness somehow and upload it into a machine, and that'll become some kind of an avatar. That's the digitally human aspect. But that's not really going to be you. You know, even Kurzweil talked about that in the age of spiritual machines, right? Now, Rothblatt's also involved in xenotransplantation. And remember, Kurzweil is also the head of the immortality division, Google, over at Google, called Calico. And that's been around for over a decade. So at one end, I'm sure you've seen the clip of Kushner recently saying that he believes they'll be the first generation to live forever or the last to die.
No, I don't think I saw that either.
So that's transhumanism for them. But on the other end, they want to enslave us and fool us into believing this digital doppelganger or mind clone is essentially going to be the same level of consciousness as us. So here's Rothblatt first being introduced as a, you know, this transgender joke of the bathroom and actually winning awards. I mean, this person's put a lot of money behind this, and then talking about this idea of a digital consciousness.
Is also the recipient of this year's Billie Jean King Leadership Initiative Award, which is devoted to LBGT issues, and puts her in an interesting issue because she has a company, or part of the company is based in North Carolina, which, as you know right now, she might get arrested for going to the bathroom if the governor had anything to do about it. Ladies and gentlemen, Martine Rothblatt. Martine, one of the basic concepts that you're interested in, it's not just improving life, but it's actually immortality, that we're all going to live forever. And Martine, I might mention, has founded a religion, as one does, known as Terrasim. It's based on transhumanism. And you have the idea that we're not just going to live a long time, but we're all going to live forever. Tell us your concept of immortality and how that actually would work.
Thanks, Neely. It's a great pleasure to be here. The idea is one that has been percolating up from lots of people in the information technology industry for a while. Perhaps Ray Kurzweil, who is a prolific inventor, is best known for the idea that as our abilities in the information processing industry, computer software, storage of more and more of our thoughts and our ideas outside of our body becomes easier, more automatic, less expensive, that ultimately we're going to have sort of digital doppelgangers of ourselves that are stored in the cloud and are able to present themselves to any manner of devices. And that as thousands and thousands of software coders and hackers and people in the maker movement work to make the software that runs these digital doppelgangers ever more lifelike, ever more human-like, there'll come sort of a tipping point when people will begin to claim that these digital doppelgangers have achieved what we call consciousness, an ability to have a sense of themselves, hopes, fears, and feelings. And at that point, I think the activity will move to the legal arena as to whether or not these digital doppelgangers really are conscious, really do have an independent legal identity. And kind of the trend of progressive thinking is once there's a scientific consensus, and in this case it would be the science of psychology, that being the science of the mind, that these digital doppelgangers are in fact cyber conscious, then they'll begin to acquire the sorts of rights and protections that we assign to even our pets. Now,
I know. Rothblatt then says basically they'll be like pets, but you and I know that's not the plan or the plot. Talks about how essentially your aunt could die, they put into another one, they don't really die. and even gets asked about the eugenics aspect of this later on and just says, oh, it'll never happen. We don't need to worry about it. No one wants a Hitler robot. And if they do rise up, humanity will rise up against it. But there you very much see it's going to be a trust the science and the lawyers moment. And the science of psychology right now has been at a tipping point, I would argue, since probably about the beginning of our lives, when they started introducing these psychotropic drugs and SSRIs in general to, I would argue, manage the population in a Huxley-esque Brave New World style. So that's the last science we want to trust in a world where everything is safe and effective. And they're pushing people into this arena, I believe, because it's the same thing for the metaverse. It's why the World, you know, the World Economic Forum has actually partnered with the metaverse, right? Yeah. It's because at the end of the day, they have a plan for the virtual era. And that's what's coming next. They want to first incorporate that, make that better than real life for most people, more endorphin rushing, and then trick them into just euthanizing themselves and uploading their consciousness into the machine, Dan.
Unbelievable stuff. And, you know, it's like you just said, they're being pushed into it, because you got to wonder who out there today wants this, or, you know, thinks that this is necessarily a good idea. I mean, once you die, who cares? You're gone. You're not going to be thinking about what your leftover consciousness is going to be doing or saying. I mean, the fact that this has to be pushed on people, and the fact that it's coming from, you know, a crossover of the transgender community is remarkable, and yet not too surprising, because that also has been pushed onto society. There's like an over-representation of that, of what we see in society based on what's actually really happening. And I think it's the same thing with this transhumanism movement. Nobody actually wants to store their consciousness in the cloud. But this is the kind of things they're going to have to talk about over and over in order for it to become a reality. But I don't think this is anything that people should ever want. Obviously, it can, if they can have that great deal of control over it, what else can they do with this stuff? And I mean, why are people trying to make themselves immoral anyways? Maybe because some of the, you know, choices they've made in life, they know in their subconscious they're going to maybe have to meet their maker someday, and are maybe going to have to be held accountable for some of the things that they did in their lives that were maybe bad or wrong. And a lot of people don't like that feeling, so they'd rather just disconnect from the idea of having to deal with an almighty creator who may have to, you know, deal with you for the things you've done. It's much more comfortable to just think that you can live forever in technology throughout this, you know, cloud of consciousness. It's really quite it's like a big slap in the face to God, really.
Well, I'd say this, you know, if we were taking this technology and using it to empower humanity, in other words, you were giving it to the general public, you were living long and healthy lives, and essentially the only way you would die would be some kind of a car accident or a malicious act. That's on the aspect of basically this techno-biological fountain of youth. And man has been looking for that fountain of youth forever. There are tales and fables for generations. There's the tree of life, the conquistadors looking for, you know, all those things. Now, that's the other end of this, because they want that digital doppelganger where you not only allow, you were talking about your thoughts to be read, but you allow the internet of bodies to come in with this new bio nanotech. And they're like, no, we'll totally replicate you. Won't be a big deal. But then there are those that want to be at the top. I would argue the Ubermenschen. And Rothblatt is United Therapeutics, and this idea of basically using this technology in a manner where you can replace a heart, you can replace a kidney, etc. And Calico is about not just regenerative medicine, but reverse aging. And here's the Kush. We're going to bring them up. Little Cushy, talking about what I believe is their idea of transhumanism.
Friend. And then finally, I think that from you know, the last year, the one thing I've tried to put a priority on since I left the White House was, you know, getting some exercise in. I think that there's a good probability that my generation is, hopefully with the advances in science, either the first generation to live forever or the last generation that's going to die. And so we need to keep ourselves in pretty good shape.
So he wants to keep himself in pretty good shape. I really believe that this is what's going on. And look, just like we were talking about Musk earlier, who's pushing the human brain interface technologies. Again, that's DARPA, NASA tech from 50, 60 years ago that they're now commercializing, right?
He also says AI is like the greatest threat to humanity while saying he's going to put a neuro chip in people's brains. So how do you, how do you make up that disconnect there? What do you make of that disconnect where he says AI is potentially the biggest threat to humanity, yet he's kind of leading the charge when it comes to implanting chips in the brain?
Well, I would encourage people to read my cover story over at the RC Reader. 5 reasons why Elon Musk should not be trusted. I think it's that some of these people with some of these over-the-top ideas also have to put it out benevolently. I don't think Musk is ignorant, right? I think that Musk's a pretty smart guy, but in large case, a front man, and he's got a whole PR team behind him. He's not tweeting all day. He's not really even running all these companies all day. He's kind of a front man for all these organizations. But then you got these, instances of someone like Ray Kurzweil, who's the kind of the father of this idea of the singularity and transhumanism in general. And like I said, he's got an alter ego, a woman persona. It's very bizarre. But he also says, and I've got these clips too, I don't know if I'll be able to play them, but he basically says, Dan, that we're not overpopulated. He talks about in 2018 at a forum that he's having a discussion where he was a professor for this Israeli minister who is also in the IMF. Okay. And basically this person said, well, we don't have, as far as resources go, because he says by like 2030, 2035, we'll have an abundance of everything. That's what everybody promises you, right? Musk recently promised you'll have whatever you want at the launch of the Optimus bot. Literally. It's one of these pie-in-the-sky misnomers while they're restricting you through carbon credits. But he says this, and basically the woman asks him, well, we don't have more land. That's a resource we can't have. He goes, look, we only use about 5% of the usable land. With the virtual technology, we'll be able to spread out. There's 95% more usable land on there. And then he also says something else. He says by then, solar will be so good, 10,000, we'll be only using a 10,000th of its power, but it'll be able to basically power the earth. These are those pie-in-the-sky things. But that's them, I think, spinning it like, don't worry, we're not going to cull the population. Meanwhile, there's a guy named Dennis Bushnell, and Bushnell authored this document all the way back in 2001, 2001, by the way, pre-9/11, okay? And in it, they talked about the technological ages of humankind. And in 2020, they said they would get into the bio-nano era. Now, obviously, biological nanotechnology existed before then, but they did just start injecting, billions of people with bio-nanotech in 2020. And this was predicted 19 years earlier. And you notice that the next age is that virtual age I talk of. All right? What's really interesting is all this is at the guise of what? Global warming, pollution. It always is, just like the Club of Rome. But they openly talk about the genomic design and repair of the human species, cross-species molecular breeding. And this is very much a war document. Okay, you see CIA, DARPA, DIA, NRO, even Australian DOD. They tell you at the bottom here that this is all based on existing technologies, data trends, not pixie dust. And basically, this has been a blueprint for what we've seen in the last 20 years. It even talks about shock and awe pre-Iraq and CNN syndrome. I mean, there's a lot in this document. That man who authored that is the chief scientist at NASA. NASA, by the way, and Elon Musk, they're like peanut butter and jelly, my friend. SpaceX, best Boeing, this is 2 weeks ago, to become NASA's largest for-profit vendor. So it's not about going to the moon or Mars. They're launching Starlink and Blackjack satellites. Those are the spy satellites that we know about. He's moving military cargo. He's the DoD's largest contractor. And those things are raining death showers on the Ukrainian opposition via Ghost and Sidewinder drones. That's the reality of Elon Musk. Now, to get back to Bushnell in a moment, I do want to pull up this clip because it's worth watching. This is in, I believe, do we have the sustainability? I don't have that one right here, but I do have this. The human contaminated machines virtual aspect of this, but before that, the brain chip aspect of this. If I were to ask you, Dan, that in 2018, how many human brain chips were in people? And we're not talking cochlear implants. We're not talking retinal implants. We're talking straight up human brain interfaces. 2018, almost 5 years ago, how many folks would you say the head of NASA says has these brain chips?
A couple?
A
like
couple?
3?
Like 3? Well, Dan, get ready to boogie down, my friend.
Humans are now becoming cyborgs. We have cochlear implants to hear, artificial retinas to see, artificial hearts to live, artificial limbs to move, artificial organs to functions, and brain chips. There's a couple 100,000 people wandering around with brain chips now to fix congenitally defective brains and increasingly to fix memory and other things. DARPA's working on brain chips for super soldiers. And people are now working, thanks to Musk and other people, funding on direct machine-brain communications. It's not us versus them, us versus the machines. We're merging. And this is the human evolution of the humans. There is no more natural evolution of anything. People are convinced that the human evolution of everything is 10 million times faster than any natural evolution. And so this is just part of the human evolution. Of the humans.
Wow.
So
you know, if this is something they're openly talking about back in 2018, it really makes you wonder what else are they is happening that they haven't been telling us about? Because often, it comes out many years later about what is actually being worked on. So, wow, that's amazing. The fact that like in 2018, hundreds of thousands of brain chips. I mean, how far along are we really at now? Are there millions today? I mean, this is crazy.
Well, wetware has been going on for some time publicly. I have him in 2011 at another forum where they tell you that sustainable is a code word for your standard of living plummeting. Talks about how it's Malthus 101. Talks about openly instigating global population control that changes everything. All right. So he literally talks about all those. And then he also talks about how the code word is productivity improvement for the automation of everything, as they bring you kind of into this UBI system. And back then they'd had 10,000. So in 2011, he said 10,000 people had those brain chips. Now, as I said, this wetware stuff is not new. And even now they're selling you on these brain chips. This is Science News this year. As a way to cope with depression. You can tell that this woman's very happy, Dan, because she's alone outside, extremely overweight with a brain chip and a mask on, gardening. The brain chip has worked extremely well. And Musk is really fronting for this device in 6 hours to thread the Neuralink brain chip in, but that technology has been around forever. And even more alarmingly, he talks about the merging of man and machine. He talks about how human beings have just taken over all of evolution of every species. That's alarming because me and you, we don't get a decision in that, right? They're taking over the entire species and every species. And this is him discussing where it all goes at the end of the day. Very short clip, but folks, you're going to want to hear what Mr. Bushnell says, because I think that we might want to strive for something better, Dan, in a society.
This all ends up with uploading into the machines, and instead of us versus them, humans versus the machines, we become them, or they become us, or you end up with human contaminated machines.
Did he say human contaminated machines?
You heard it correct. And you got to understand, you know, Ray Kurzweil, when he pushes this stuff, they're always talking about carbon-based life and post-carbon-based life, because these are not going to be carbon-based life. You know, you'll probably see some genomically altered species as they move you towards a non-carbon system. We've already seen it. We've now been indoctrinated by decades to demonize carbon, and they want to use that carbon control mechanism at the core of their quote-unquote social credit score and a tokenized economy. And again, I mean, I'm not these people. These people have much more power and influence than me. But I also didn't write From Transgender to Transhuman, a manifesto of the freedom of form, and then advocate for digital doppelgangers, Dan. That's not this guy. That's who I just showed you.
Yeah, that is wild, man. Thank you for enlightening me to that, because these are, you know, two areas that I've been covering for quite some time, kind of joining together and molding in the middle, and it's absolutely remarkable. But I mean, I'm surprised at these conferences and stuff. Even people in the audience, do they not feel like this is like science fiction movie talk stuff? Like, are they not sitting there going like, are we really talking about this like in the real world, in reality? Like, I mean, how the heck did we get to this point where this is real and we're actually considering uploading consciousness into the cloud to have a digital doppelganger? I just, it's mind-boggling.
You know, you thought we didn't, you know, the track trace database society was enough, but we live there now. You know, the things that we talked about a decade plus ago have come into fruition. The Internet of Things is real. Metadata is everywhere. The executive has expanded not just from the Patriot Act to Homeland Security and the fusion centers that we used to talk about, but now into the signature reduction program. Are you aware of that?
The which, sorry? The
signature reduction program. So if you're not aware of that, again, we live in a post-truth world where over the last decade, so in other words, after they had established their fusion centers, they began a program called signature reduction. And I'll just read you the first paragraph. Now, a lot of this has to do with internet bots and that type of stuff, but it gets much, much, much more intricate. The largest undercover force the world has ever known. So when we talk about the brown shirts or the Gestapo, they ain't got nothing on us. Is the one created by the Pentagon over the past decade. Some 60,000 people now belong to this secret army, many working under masked identities and in low profile, all part of a broad program called signature reduction. The force, more than 10 times the size of the clandestine elements of the CIA, carries out domestic, that's here, and foreign assignments both in military uniform and under civilian cover, in real life and online, sometimes hiding in private businesses, geez, weird, those are Trojan horse civilian systems, by the way, and consultancies, some of them household names. Now, aside from the bot army, let me show you just some of the technology that they have. And again, this is what they're showing you right here. There's never been any kind of a hearing on this. There's been no oversight whatsoever. Now, you think you're looking at a hand. Talk about transhumanism. Oh, no, friend. You're looking at a hand glove that actually can have anyone's biometric information on it that slides over your hand and emit human oils, Dan. So, you know, you're part of this Internet of Bodies thing. You've given up all your information, your DNA. Wouldn't be hard to frame somebody in a world of deep fakes and readily available biometric data in which a signature reduction program with no oversight has backdoor access into intricate file systems that are identifiers. In other words, you can get into the DMVs of some places, the Social Security. You can create identities or co-opt them. This is the post-truth world we live in, Dan Dix. And I know that you've been fighting it hardcore. Let's finish this up in about 7-8 minutes. We've been doing almost an hour, but how do we combat this in a very real post-truth world? And I know you do it every day, but damn, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, obviously, awareness is still key. I mean, there's certain things here I wasn't even aware of. So if if society and people don't generally know that this is even an issue or a problem in the first place, then it's going to continue to march on towards that agenda. So right now, I think awareness is key. But beyond that, we have to start actively disconnecting ourselves from technology when and where possible. You know, I always advocate for a electronic detox. I do it a couple of times a year. I will you know, go away for maybe 5 days or somewhere where you don't look at a single screen, no phones, no laptop, no TVs, nothing. And it's just a small thing that you can do for your own health and for your own psyche, but also just to, you know, get used to being a little more disconnected from everything, because as they try to connect us in ways that you've shown us here that are just remarkable, we need to continue to disconnect ourselves. So I think we just need to really think about how we use the technology that we're using and we're surrounding ourselves with. And you maybe think about taking a break here and there. I mean, for guys like you and me, it's a little more difficult because, you know, kind of our livelihoods and our work is involved in this. I mean, people are looking at us on a screen right now. But having said that, it's really, really important to you know, not fall into this trap of control, because ultimately, as you know, and we know, that's ultimately what it is. So, and this can be done in little ways, you know, like get yourself a Faraday cage for your phone, for example, so that you're not, like, you know, being tracked everywhere you go, or you just leave your phone at home altogether. Yeah, there's little things you can do moving forward. But I think, again, back to the main issue is awareness is going to be key, because there's not enough people who even are aware that this is an issue or a problem in the first place. So I think, yeah, shows like this are going to help. So glad to be a part of it.
Well, I love you, brother. I love your work. Tell my audience what you have been covering, what to look for, how you got your YouTube channel back just randomly after, you know, I think you had well over 500,000 subscribers, gone one day, back the next, months and months later, maybe even over a year later.
Yeah, that was wild. My YouTube channel, 250,000 subscribers, got terminated completely out of the blue. Just no community guideline strikes, no copyright strikes, nothing like that. No warnings, nothing. I had a clean channel, and boom, it was gone, terminated. It was actually 7 months later that I got they contacted me through Twitter. I got a tweet from Team YouTube saying, Dan, we are very sorry. We deeply apologize. We've looked into this, and we found that we've made a huge mistake. We've reinstated your channel. We apologize for the inconvenience. We're looking into this to find out what happened here, but we're sorry, and here's your channel back. And that was completely out of the blue. I was just like, wow, okay then. But oddly enough, I'm still heavily shadow banned to this day. In fact, I just had my channel, I was banned from posting for a week for so-called medical misinformation just a few days ago. They just gave it back, you know. So I'm still on the chopping block, no doubt about that. So yeah, I do have the channel back, remarkably, and I will continue to use it because it has been a big part of my life for the last 16 years or whatever.
Well, listen, it's a tool, right? Everybody listen,
yeah.
And I've moved to a bunch of different platforms. I'm on the Rumble, I'm on the Rockfin, I've got a Getter, now we got a Gab, you know, I'm on Odyssey, I'm on Podbean, you know, you can find me on Spotify, all these things, right? It gets overwhelming, and unfortunately, even though, again, YouTube isn't really a company, it's an extension of the media military industrial complex. It's a Trojan horse civilian system. Everybody who goes, you can trade on the stock market. I'm like, it doesn't even make a profit. Just like Tesla didn't make a profit for years. Think about that. Amazon didn't have to make a profit for years and years and years. That's obviously subsidized and obviously put into a situation that's beyond monopoly, but it brings new people in. You're not trying to preach to the choir all the time. And you've got to use the enemy's weapon systems against them. And you better bet your ass that Instagram is a weapon system. Twitter is a weapon system. Okay, Facebook is a weapon system. And YouTube is a weapon system. And the better myself and guys like Dan Dix and others can utilize that weapon system against them, the more we need to do it, period.
Yeah, this whole thing is it's a huge double-edged sword, and we have the ability now. What would have taken a couple $1 million and satellite dishes and editing vans, you know, maybe 30, 40 years ago, would have taken all that to do what we do today. We can do with a device in the tip of our fingers, with a free, you know, platform. There's really no excuse at this point as to why anybody cannot get involved in doing the things that you and I do, because you know, we have the technology at our fingertips, and it's relatively free to start a website and a YouTube channel, for example. So we have the ability to get out there and have this information to be seen by millions of people. So we gotta jump on this now at every opportunity while we still can, because we know they're clamping down on us. We know you're on the chopping block, I'm on the chopping block, but we're going to continue to tell people about all these issues as much as we can while we still can before it's too late.
Pressfortruth.ca is the website. Press for Truth are the various social media channels. Dan Dix, you kick ass, you take names. I love you, brother. We got to do this more often. I think it's probably been over 6 months, maybe even closer to a year since the last time we did a broadcast together, which is clearly unacceptable. I keep an eye on your stuff quite a bit, watching in the background while I'm making thumbnails, and I just want to thank you for everything you do. There were so many subjects we didn't get to talk about, such as the election, such as the post-COVID 1984 Canadian world. So we'll have to do it in the next month or so and talk about those subjects as well.